Oh la 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 bam bam. Oh la 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 bam bam. Oh la 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 bam bam. Oh la 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 la. Big it up. Oh la 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 la. Dig it up. Oh la 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 bam bam. Bir bam bam bir bam bir de. Bir bam bam. Bir bam bir de. Bir bam bam bir bam bam bir bam bir de. Bir bam bam. Bir bam bir bam 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 bam. Bir bam bir de. Bir bam bam.
Welcome everyone to Home and Away Jamaica, where we connect Jamaica with the diaspora. Today we have with us Mr. Miguel Nelson, Application Secretariat Branch Manager for NEPA, National Environment and Planning Agency. Good morning, Miguel. Happy to have you.
Good morning, Mr. Taylor. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Miguel, what we try to do each week is to give some kind of deep dive information to members in the diaspora and also locally in Jamaica on various aspects of either the home approval, real estate approval process, things that may seem fairly distant. And many times we see where persons abroad are trying to, immerse themselves into a transition to return home. They get caught up in many instances with persons who, are not ideal representatives. And we think by sharing with our listenership or viewership some of what's required in the approval process, they can be more enlightened. So when they engage a professional to act on their behalf, they can ask the necessary questions. So it's our duty to inform them. And NEPA is, undoubtedly one of those agencies that are or is very critical in the approval process, but many people, I think, don't quite understand NEPA's role. There is the environment protection aspect, and I think many people sense and feel that NEPA's mandate weighs more heavily in that area. But NEPA also has a planning role. So explain to our viewership, Miguel, what is NEPA's role and responsibility?
Okay, so NEPA is an executive agency which performs the administrative and technical functions of three authorities. The Natural Resources Conservation Authority, which is the environmental arm, the Town and Country Planning Authority, which is the planning/subdivision arm, and the Land Development Utilization Commission, which is also involved in subdivision applications. So the agency straddles both environment and planning. We provide guidance in terms of developing the framework for planning with respect to the promulgation of what we call development orders, which sets the broad uses for lands throughout the country. And a lot of time persons are not fully aware of how involved we are in that process, as you mentioned earlier. In terms of the environment, more persons are aware of that, but we are involved in the processing and granting of approvals in respect of environmental permissions, so environmental licenses, environmental permits, beach licenses, etc.
So what I'm understanding from this, Miguel, is that you have you wear three separate hats. You have the environmental aspect, where you broadly preserve environmental issues and review and assess. You
Right.
also have the planning aspect where you plan out, for example, different areas of development within, let's say, the city of Kingston. So you do zoning, you determine which areas may be best suited for multifamily, offices, mixed use, and so on. And you're also involved in the planning, in the approval process for construction, for developments that may take place either on a whole-scale development level or the individual level.
Yes. So just to put it plainly, so in general, development applications require various approvals. So you'd have building permission, planning permission. Depending on what you're doing, you may need subdivision approval, or you may need environmental permits or environmental clearances. NEPA is involved in all processes, all of those approvals except the granting of building permission. So at all stages in all approvals, we are involved, save and except for building approval. So in terms of environmental clearance, we are the agency that does the review and makes recommendations to the authority for the grant of such approvals. In respect of planning approvals, once we have developed the orders which grants the uses, the zoning, say for example, an area to be used for commercial or residential or say industrial, if an application comes in that is in keeping with those zoning, then the parish council has the responsibility of granting, or the municipal corporation, sorry, as they are called now, has a responsibility of granting final approval. But we are also involved because we provide recommendations to the parish councils on such applications. If there's an application for planning approval, though, that goes contrary to the zoning, then that decision has to be made by the TCPA, the Town and Country Planning Authority, which NEPA is the administrative and the technical arm of. And so we would review such applications and make a recommendation to the TCPA, who would grant that approval to the applicant or the proponent.
So Miguel, let's take a practical example, something that probably confronts some of our viewers or listeners. Someone purchases land and they would like to build a single-story dwelling on this land. How, in this process, development process, how and where does NEPA touch that person's application?
All right, so if it is a single-family residential dwelling, it is unlikely that we would be involved, right? Because usually for a development like that, the land would probably be zoned residential. And so what the applicant would need primarily is building approval. And so that is an application that is usually dealt with primarily by the municipal corporations. If it were a larger development, say a multifamily development, like what you see going up in and around the corporate area, so apartment buildings and such, then that would come to NEPA. So let's say that the area is zoned for the use. Say it is a residential development being constructed on a parcel of land that is zoned for residential use. The applicant, the proponent, would require planning permission, building planning permission from the municipal corporation, and they would submit those applications to the municipal corporations. The municipal corporation would review the application and refer the planning application to NEPA for a recommendation. We would review, ensure that all the planning criteria are satisfied, and we would make a recommendation to the municipal corporations, which would be taken into consideration at their meetings where approval is granted. The proponent may also require an environmental permit for the development. So if the multifamily development has 10 units or more, then an environmental permit would be required. And they would submit that application directly to NEPA. And we would review, make a recommendation to the NRCA for the grant or refusal of said environmental permits.
Thanks, Miguel. So let's clarify something you said earlier. We're having a discussion on the basis that any land bought has residential approval. Suppose, someone has family land in a rural community that has been zoned or traditionally used for farming or agricultural purposes. And over time, that use has changed, and that person or the family in general want to subdivide that land and change its use for residential purposes. Is NEPA involved in that process?
Right. Yes, we would be also involved in that process. So what would happen is that that individual would apply again through the municipal corporation for subdivision approval. And they would, in that application for subdivision approval, outline the proposed uses for the lands that they intend to subdivide. And the parish council would refer that application, sorry, the municipal corporations would refer that application to NEPA, and we would review and make a recommendation back to the municipal corporations for the final decision to be made on the grant of the subdivision, including the assigning the uses now to the parcels of land to be created as a result of the subdivision.
Okay, great. So what I'm understanding you to say is for specific land use permission, NEPA may have a role or involvement where there may be the need to change that use.
Yes, once it is contrary to the legal zoning.
Where it concerns a single family dwelling, any permit, permission, approval generally resides with the municipal corporation, which we traditionally know as a parish council. Outside of that, once you're doing above 10 units in a subdivision, then those approvals are escalated to NEPA.
Correct.
Great. Now, generally, what enforcement powers does NEPA have? Because that's also a part of your remit, we understand.
Yes. So the agency enforces under both the Town and Country Planning Authority Act, so the TCPA Act, and we also have enforcement powers under the Natural Resources Conservation Authority Act. So in instances where permits are granted, there usually are stipulations, conditions that the developer, the proponent would be required to comply with. And the agency would conduct routine monitoring and, if necessary, take the relevant enforcement action. The same goes for permissions that are granted under by the TCPA. So if planning permission is granted by the TCPA, we also do our routine monitoring and ensure that the development is being conducted in accordance with the conditions of the approvals granted.
And outside of building permits, environmental permits, what is some of the scope of permitting that you're involved in?
Okay, all right. So in terms of environmental permits, there are in excess of 100 categories. So what the law has done is the NRCA has sought to identify various activities or types of development that are likely to have a negative impact on the environment, and sought to place these as categories in the legislation. So there are specific categories of development that are deemed to potentially have negative impacts on the environment and as such require environmental permits. So it ranges from construction and operation of power generation facilities. We spoke about residential multifamily developments, also office commercial developments of a certain size, hydrocarbon storage, petroleum storage, hazardous waste, transportation and treatment, solid waste treatment and disposal facilities, pipelines, sewage treatment plants. There are a lot of them.
Wide range.
Wide range.
Miguel, before we wrap up, what I want to ask you to share with us, and particularly since we're on the issue of permits, I know the agency has a permit renewal drive. I know, for example, we had issues with beach permits, renewal of beach permits. I know in the COVID period, we had the interruption of many of our beach operators, hotel operators. Give us some more information on your permit renewal drive.
Okay, so this is two-pronged. So the beach licenses have always required renewal. That legislation was passed in 1956. And basically what happens with a beach license is that an individual gets permission to use or encroach on lands that are in the possession of the Crown. And so the individual or entity would be required to, on a yearly basis, renew that license if they intend to continue the activity or maintain the encroachment. So generally, individuals are required by the 31st of March each year to renew their beach licenses if they intend to carry on the activity or maintain the encroachments. In terms of the environmental permits, originally when that piece of legislation was promulgated, persons who, when it was promulgated, environmental permits had no definite lifespan. So permits were indefinite. So once you were granted a permit, you would carry on the activities in accordance with the conditions outlined forever, so to speak. In 2015, there was an amendment of the legislation which now requires that permits have a lifetime of 5 years. And the legislation also indicated that all environmental permits granted before the 1st of April 2015 would expire on the 31st of March 2020. And so all those environmental permits now, if the individual wishes to carry on the activity, would be up for renewal. And once those permits are renewed, then they will be valid for a period of 5 years, and they'll now have to renew those permits every 5 years going forward. And the requirements are simple. We just ask that you complete the application form, submit a project brief outlining how the activity is being conducted now, and we would compare that with what we have on our records to see if there has been any change. And if there's no change and there have been no environmental breaches, then we would seek to renew the permits.
Well, Miguel, thank you. We could go on and on and on. There are so many aspects of NEPA's role in the development and the environmental process, but we thank you for at least shedding some light on some of these areas and informing and educating our viewers and listeners. So thanks again. Miguel Nelson, Application Secretariat Branch Manager for the National Environment and Planning Agency. Thanks, Miguel. It was good having you on Home and Away, Jamaica.
It was great to be here, Mr. Taylor. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
TV, bam bam, on the street, bam bam.